Hello and welcome to this presentation on Philippians 2 and the Incarnation, emptying ourselves of bad exegesis. This is part 2 of a short 3 or 4 part series on Philippians 2 where we expound the greatness of God's Word. I'm here with Liam, Peter, Mika, and myself. It's over to you, Liam. God bless.
Okay, so previously we spoke about the form of God and what it means to be in the form of God, which talks about the outward appearance of God. And we established that Jesus was in the outward appearance of God on the earth during his ministry. Today we're going to continue with that thought to expound upon it and to prove that that interpretation is more accurate with Scripture. But before we do that, we have to continue on with these verses where it says that Jesus didn't steal or to pillage to be equal with God. And if you notice in these verses in Philippians, that's the very next sentence. So the key Greek word here that's translated as this word is harpagmon, which I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but that's what the Greek word is. And where Paul says, who being inherently in the form of God deems it not pillaging to be equal with God. So this is the verse we're going to be speaking about. Just briefly, Knock, the translator of the concordance, he put in an English word called inherently in the form of God, and that might not entirely be accurate to the Greek text. We didn't speak about this on part 1 because there's a lot of things to speak about, of course, but the word inherently might be connected to nature, but because he's inherently in the form of God, not in the nature of God, he's inherently, or he began in the outward appearance of God. And we established that was on the earth. So there's no relation to conscious preexistence here, at least not in this verse. But we can speak about that in the future more in depth. So when it comes to this Greek word harpagmon, it's to do with snatching or seizing by force or plundering, which you could say is Jesus taking advantage of a position for selfish gain. So it means something like a thing to exploit or an act of plunder, an opportunity for advantage. Paul is effectively saying that Jesus does not consider his equality with God, which we will speak about, an opportunity for advantage, exploitation, or plunder. He didn't take advantage of his status as God's son. So Jesus is equal with God, yes, but how exactly? We must discuss how Jesus was equal with God, as it is regularly misinterpreted to mean that he is co-equally God with Yahweh in a Trinity, or that he is also God. His equality with God does not mean that he has an identical essence or nature with God. No, it comes from the fact that Jesus Christ is God's son. Therefore, he's the son of the house. He has equality with God, which is not to say that he is co-equal, because Jesus himself said that the Father is greater than I. So he cannot literally be co-equal, but he has a same aspect of equality with God because he represents God. He's the form of God. He's his son. So Jesus shares in authority and status, not in nature. We see this being expressed in John chapter 5, verse 18. Therefore then the Jews sought the more to kill Christ, for he not only annulled the Sabbath, but said that his own Father also is God, making himself equal to God. So it's not because Jesus is also God, that's why he has an equality with God, it's because he's the Son of God. If you're still in doubt that Jesus is the Son of God and not God himself, you can go to the very next verse, in verse 19, where Jesus says that I can do nothing of myself. This is not the words of God. Because if he was actually God, he would not need someone to help him do something. God can do everything by himself, whereas Jesus can do nothing of himself, because it's God who empowers him. So the Jews in this verse were accusing Christ of making himself equal to God by calling himself to be the Son of God. So that's why he has an equality with God.
And it is very important, by the way, to really understand the equality with God by being the Son of God. Because it's really true, just like we mentioned in the previous part, that the son of the house has approximately the same authority as the father. So we need to really get used to this way of thinking.
Yes. So I'm going to give you some examples of Jesus not taking advantage of his status as God's son. My first example is that he refused the temptations of Satan. In Matthew chapter 4, we see this perfectly, starting in verse 3. And approaching, Satan said to Jesus, "If you are truly God's son, say that these stones may be becoming as cakes of bread." And in verse 6, Satan tempts Jesus again by saying to him, "If you are truly God's son, cast yourself down from the temple, for it is written that his messengers shall be directing concerning thee, and on their hands shall they be lifting thee, lest at some time thou shouldst be dashing thy feet against a stone." And finally, after refusing this temptation, he tries one more time to tempt him, saying again, Satan takes Christ along to a very high mountain and is showing him all the kingdoms of the earth, all the kingdoms of the world, and the glory that they have. And he said to him, "All these to you will I be giving you, if ever you fall down and you should be worshiping me." And once again, Jesus refused this temptation. Even though it was in his power to turn the stones into bread, even though it was within his ability to call upon the legions of messengers to save him from things, he didn't use his authority for his own advantage. Instead, he resisted the temptations of Satan and he obeyed his God and Father. This is a prime example. What Jesus could have done if he exploited his equality with God for his own benefit would be to turn the stones into bread so that he could eat them, of course. Throw himself off the temple to display divine protection, to prove that he's the Messiah and the Son of God. And of course, to claim the kingdom of the world immediately, because it was his birthright. But instead, he refused to use his sonship for personal advantage, and he submitted entirely to the Father's will. Why does this show that Jesus did not pillage equality? Because he did not exploit his unique relationship with God, being the only begotten Son, to bypass suffering, hunger, trial, or submission. This is exactly what Paul meant by coming to be in the likeness of humanity and being found in fashion as a human shortly after this verse. He's not referring to Jesus who pre-existed as something else and then became a man. Jesus is a man. He became like us because Jesus, being inherently in the form of God, the outward appearance of God, all of this status and privilege, he is not like us because we are not the only begotten Son of God. But yet he didn't use this for his own advantage, and he came to be just like us, who are not the only begotten Son of God. You see my point? Despite his high status as God's Son, he humbled himself by not taking advantage of his status and his privilege for his own benefit. This is what it means to not be pillaging equality with God. He didn't have to steal it because he had it inherently because he's God's Son. My second example is Jesus declining his kingship. In John chapter 6, verse 14 to 15, it says, "The man then perceiving," now this is an Israelite who is perceiving Christ, which the signs that Christ does, said that this truly is the prophet who is coming into the world. He's basically recognizing Jesus as the Messiah. Jesus then, knowing that they are about to come and snatch him, that they should be making him king, retires again into the mountains by himself alone. When some of the Israelites wanted to make Christ king by force, Jesus did not accept that, although it was his birthright. Instead, he refused. Even though the throne of Israel was his, he could have accepted the kingship and ruled all of Israel and legally wielded his God-granted authority as the Messiah. But instead, he withdrew to the mountains alone. He rejected all earthly authority and continued obeying his Father's will for him to be a suffering servant. He refused to seize legitimate authority, which shows that he didn't pillage equality with God. Throughout the entirety of his ministry, he didn't claim the throne of David, which was his by birthright. Instead, he obeyed his Father's will. That shows humility and obedience.
Yep, exactly.
And finally, he was declining to seek his own glory. In fact, throughout the entirety of his ministry on the earth, He never once acted out of self-interest. He repeatedly said things like, I can do nothing of myself. My teaching is not mine. I do nothing of myself. I speak just as the Father commanded me to do. He could have claimed that all of these miracles and signs came from himself, but he never did. Although he had the temptation to exalt himself, which is why Satan tempted him by saying, I can give you all the kingdoms of the earth if you bow down and worship me. And Jesus responded with, you shall worship the one true God alone, which means that Jesus cannot be the one true God if he's saying to Satan that the first commandment is to worship God.
Yep.
Instead of exalting himself, Jesus obeyed his God and Father to serve him. He exalted the Father and came to serve, not to be served. Although you could say that it was his right to be served because he is God's Son and the Messiah. Instead, he came to serve. And a really good example of that is Jesus washing his disciples' feet. One of the best examples of Jesus not pillaging equality with God is his act of washing his servants' feet. This event occurred not long before the Garden of Gethsemane, which was the event shortly before Christ was crucified. We see this in John chapter 13. John emphasizes in verse 3 that knowing that the Father has given all things into his hands, referring to Jesus, which means that Jesus had ultimate authority. He was the Son of God. He was the Messiah, and he was his disciples' master. He was their rabbi, their teacher. And yet, in spite of all of this, he washed their feet. So what did Jesus do? He did not use these things, these titles and statuses, being the outward appearance of God, for his own advantage. He acted the role of the servant and washed his disciples' feet. And then he told his disciples to do this in remembrance of me. You could say that he took the outward appearance of a servant or a slave. Even though previously he was in the outward appearance of God, now he's acting as the role of the slave. He laid aside his garments and took a garment of a slave, the role of a slave and the outward appearance of a slave. And he performed the lowest household task, which was often done by slaves, which is to wash your feet. Instead of using his authority as the Son of God to command praise and respect, he lowered himself to the bottom of the social ladder. He acted not just as a slave, but as the lowest one possible. You know what that explains? That is a great example of humility.
Yep.
That's also a great example of this humility that Paul wants us to imitate. Being inherently in the form of God, nevertheless, he empties himself, taking upon the form of a slave. And he doesn't take advantage of his status as God's son for personal gain. Instead, he obeyed his God and Father all the way to the end. Which is where we get to probably the most important point in all of these verses today, especially when it comes to the incarnation, which is when he empties himself. Now, when it comes to this, we have to ask a very... Oh, go ahead.
Can I say something quickly? It's very important to realize, thinking about Satan tempting Christ, it's very important to realize that Christ had the capacity to sin. He could have sinned. Very important, because if that was impossible, then the whole temptation event in the wilderness was stupid, was totally pointless. So it had a reason, because he could have sinned, but he didn't sin because he had Holy Spirit without measure. But he could have sinned. Very important to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
But he didn't.
Also, another place Jesus could have used his power was when he said to Pilate that he could bring 12 legions of angels
Exactly.
to his rescue. So it's yet another time Jesus is subordinating himself under the will of God rather than doing something in his own power.
Yeah. It's like Christ was a boxer, and he was the greatest boxer of all time. And he could have easily beat up the Pharisees, but instead of doing that, he humbles himself. You know, he has the ability to do it, but he doesn't do it.
Yeah.
And that's humility.
Could have fried them in their shoes.
Yep.
Yep.
He could have called upon the legions of messengers to take him off the cross just before he was about to die and then miraculously heal himself if he wanted to, but he didn't.
Exactly. He let himself be beaten up.
This is yet another good example of why it is important for us believers to read the whole Bible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We get so caught up and told that it's only Paul's letters that are important. But this obviously shows us that we gotta benefit from reading the whole scripture.
You can't understand Paul's epistles without understanding other scripture.
Yeah.
Yeah, because then you'll come away with ideas like the incarnation and the conscious preexistence of Christ.
Yes,
which is something that Paul did not teach.
Yep.
So when it comes to this very important phrase, empties himself, we have to ask a very important question. When and where did Jesus Christ empty himself, and of what? He didn't empty himself of a God nature or a pre-existing life in the celestials. It is a voluntary humbling by changing his form or his outward appearance, or you could say his role and conduct, from that of God, being the image of God and the Son of God and God's representative on the earth, to that of a slave. All of this occurred on the earth. It did not occur in heaven, or at least partially. Specifically in the Garden of Gethsemane, where he fully submitted himself to his Father's will. He emptied himself of his status, or his role, his birthright as the Messiah. He did not empty himself of his nature, because when Jesus was going to the cross, he was still a man, just as much of a man as he was beforehand. It's not like he transformed himself into a giraffe. That's not what happened here. Remember, these verses are all about mindset. They're not about nature. And the four accounts of our Lord and his ministry on the earth give plenty examples of this. And if you don't know what the four accounts are, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The primary is Jesus submitting to his Father in the Garden of Gethsemane. That's when he took the form of a slave.
Well, just a comment on that, though. I think there's a kind of a translucent
thread.
Like it's. I think taking the form of a slave, you can see throughout several passages, like we just said, like places where Jesus didn't misuse his abilities, so to say, or power. But I think we can say that it really escalated or started to speed up in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Yeah. True.
Yeah, there's plenty of examples before this where he's displaying humility.
Gradual was the word I was looking for. It's a gradual transition.
Yeah, it's a gradual thing. And I would say this was the moment where he's no longer heralding. He's not in his ministry. Now it's just complete obedience. He's not going to perform some miracles. He's not going to save himself. He's in complete obedience to his God. And that's the act of a slave. You could say that he's the slave of God now, instead of being the son of God beforehand, which doesn't mean that he's not the son of God. It's just,
after he declared that he was the Messiah, reading Isaiah 61, they sought to throw him off a mountain then, and he walked right through them. Yeah. So he didn't submit to it then. Yeah. See what I'm saying?
Yes. And also, keep in mind, remember the fact that we already mentioned it earlier, that the word empties in that passage in Philippians 2, empties is in the aorist form, in the aorist tense, meaning it is a fact regardless of time. So it was the case then, back then, but it's now still the case while he is in heaven at the right hand of the Majesty. So keep that in mind also.
Yeah. You could say that if Jesus were down here and he were mortal, he would do the exact same thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Of course, he's not going to, because he doesn't need to, because it's a one and done thing, but he still has the same mindset.
Exactly.
And that's what's really important. So we can see this mindset and Jesus changing forms or outward appearance, specifically when he surrendered himself in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we see this in Matthew chapter 26. starting in verse 39 and going all the way to 42, where he says in a prayer to his God, "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass by from me. However, not as I will, but as thou." And again, he comes away a second time. He prays, saying, "My Father, if this can pass by from me," referring to his suffering, "if I should not drink it, let thy will be done." Here, Jesus lay aside his own desire and will to avoid his fate of being horrifically crucified, which is understandable. This is the exact moment that he empties himself of that outward appearance of God, and he doesn't take into account his own will and takes on the appearance of a slave as he accepts his future humiliation, suffering, and unjust treatment. From this moment onwards, Jesus is in the outward appearance of a slave. And yes, you can find examples of Jesus being in the form of a slave before this, but this is specifically when it happens, when it really escalates.
Yeah.
And the next thing that we see of Jesus displaying this mindset is when he allowed himself to be arrested without resistance. In Matthew chapter 26, we see that Peter cuts off the ear of one of the soldiers. And instead of encouraging him, be like, "Yes, we're going to start a rebellion because I'm the Messiah and I'm going to claim the throne of David," instead he says to him, "Comrade, for what are you present?" Then approaching, they lay hands on Jesus and hold him. And then this event takes place where Peter cuts off the guy's ear. And then Jesus says to him, Are you not supposing that I am not going to entreat my Father, and at present he will station by my side more than 12 legions of messengers? I don't need your help. That's what he's effectively trying to say to him here.
Mhm.
I don't need you to try and save me. I can save myself quite simply. I don't need you to cut this guy's ears off and to try and liberate me here. Because if it was my intention, or if it was my Father's intention to set me free from this, I can do it. I can summon 12 legions of messengers right now. Jesus did not resist arrest, though.
One single messenger would have been enough for all those soldiers. One single messenger.
Yeah. So we see that Jesus did not resist arrest here, nor did he encourage his disciples, like Peter, to set him free. He voluntarily gave himself into the hands of his enemies. In this way, he is in the outward appearance of a slave, because slaves have no agency on their lives. Although he could have called upon an army of angels to save himself, he didn't use this right. He didn't take advantage of it for his own benefit, which again comes to pillaging to be equal with God. Next, we see that Jesus submitted himself to an unjust judging before the Sanhedrin. Jesus is then dragged to the Sanhedrin, where he endures many false witnesses about him and false testimonies. We see this in Matthew chapter 26, verse 59 to 60. He does not defend himself. Instead, he remains silent throughout the majority of the time. It's only when he is exhorted to speak concerning who he is, which is the Messiah and the Son of God, does he speak. That's the actions of a slave. They only speak when spoken to. If Jesus could have easily defended himself here, he could have said, "These are false accusations. I have not blasphemed God once because I've never sinned." And I think they knew that. But they hated him so much they wanted him dead because they were a threat to their position of authority as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We see that we see in Matthew that Jesus didn't defend himself because he says, yet Jesus was silent in response to all of this. Once again, we see that Jesus did not use his authority to stop this unjust proceeding. If he did, then he wouldn't be in the outward appearance of a slave. Exactly. He would be in the outward appearance of God. He was committed to serving his Father, which is why he said back in the garden, "Not my will be done. My will says I want to free myself and prove who I am, because it's not about my will. It's about your will being done," which means I have to be a slave and I have to obey you all the way up to my death, because it was prophesied in the Old Testament, which we will get to that. Who's typing? Okay, that's better. So the next thing that we get to is Jesus enduring abuse without retaliation. We see that in Matthew 26. Once again, where Matthew says, then they spit into his face and buffet him, or they beat him. Now they slap him, saying, prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that hits you? And once again, he allows himself to be spat on, blindfolded, slapped, kicked, beaten, and mocked, all without defending himself. That's like if you were to put Mike Tyson in his prime against some kids, and he was allowing them to beat him. That's humility. You know, how simple would it be for Mike Tyson to just destroy those kids? I mean, it would be easy, but that's not the point here. He's displaying humility and obedience. And it's this mindset that Paul wants us to imitate. Back then, slaves were frequently humiliated in public to assert dominance. And this is what's happening. The Pharisees think that Jesus is their slave. This is the servant behavior that was prophesied all the way back in Isaiah chapter 50, which we will get to, about the suffering servants. The next thing that we see is Jesus being handed to Pilate and remaining silent once again. When handed to Pilate, Jesus allows himself to be transferred like a common criminal, although he never sinned. He doesn't fight back, nor does he try to assert his dominance as the seed of David, as his descendants. For an Israelite, being handed to a Gentile was a symbol of slave-like humiliation, the lowest possible social transfer. This display is a complete lack of status. His conduct is that of a slave here, not of the king of Israel, being judged by a Gentile of all. So you could say that his kingship in this moment appears to have vanished, and his authority with it. His outward appearance, therefore, or his status, his role and conduct, appears to be that of a powerless prisoner, not of the Son of God. But yet he could have freed himself at any moment. You know, those things that are binding him on this picture, I mean, he could have easily just went like that and just freed himself, but he didn't. It's like an army of mice arrested an elephant. Don't you think that the elephant free himself? Next, we see that Jesus was tortured. In John chapter 19, verses 1 to 3, we see precisely that. Then Pilate took Christ, then scourges him or whips him. And the soldiers, they braided a wreath out of thorns and placed it on his head. And with a purple cloak, they clothed him. And they came to him and said, rejoice, King of the Jews. And they give him slaps. And they were doing this to mock him because he claimed to be the King of the Jews. And this shows that they don't believe it and they're mocking him. And throughout all of this, he submits to this intense physical torture. He doesn't save himself once again. He endures the punishment for crimes that he did not commit. The Roman soldiers placed a robe and a crown of thorns and a reed in his hand. This was done to mock Jesus. This highlights his social reduction from rightful king to slave. This is the ultimate display of the radical change in outward appearance, not in his nature. If you look on the left-hand side on this picture, Jesus is still a man. He didn't transform himself into an angel or something like that. It's not about his nature. It's about his role and his mindset. During his ministry, he was in the form of God. Now he's in the form of a defeated, submissive, and humiliated slave. Now we see that Jesus was tasked to carry his own cross, and he was crucified between criminals. We see this in John chapter 19. And bearing the cross on himself, he came out to what is termed a skull's place, which is termed in Hebrew Golgotha, and that's where he was crucified. Jesus Christ, being a condemned man, valiantly went through his execution, and he carried the very instrument of his own execution on his back. Another great example of him appearing as a slave, yet he had this great strength within him, which was given by God, of course. Back then, crucifixion was a criminal's death. So being placed with real criminals alongside him shows total social degradation. This matches Paul's description of him in Philippians chapter 2, verse 8, where he says, he humbles himself, becoming obedient unto death, and not just some generic kind of death, the death on the cross, which is very specific. The next thing we see is Jesus being crucified. And while being crucified, he endures the mockery. And above all else, including through all the things that he'd been through, he prays for his executioners.
Oh, yeah.
We see in Luke chapter 23, verse 44, now Jesus says in a prayer, Father, forgive them, those who are crucifying him, for they are not aware what they are doing. Now dividing his garments, they cast the lot. So even after all he's been through, all of the humiliation and torture and lies and slander, he still refuses to save himself, even while being mocked to do so. If you can remember, I think it was the Pharisees who said to him, if you are truly God's son, why don't you just save yourself? I mean, can you imagine being in Jesus' shoes there? I mean, he could have easily saved himself. All he had to do was just click his fingers or just imagine it and it would happen. But yet he didn't. What amount of restraint did he have? This humility that he's displaying here, being in the outward appearance of a slave.
I think that was the last temptation, by the way, too. The last temptation. Because they say, the Pharisees said, come down off the cross and we will believe you. Well, he wanted them to believe him, right?
Of course.
And the relative, but he stayed on the cross. Sorry to interrupt you.
No, that's a really good point. It's also a really good example of Jesus not pillaging to be equal with God. Because if he was to do that, he would do it for his own benefit, because of course he would save himself from this fate. But that's not his Father's will. So instead of doing that, he empties himself, taking on the form of a slave. It's an ongoing thing. So it's not necessarily one event, although you could say that the majority of this mindset was displayed in his actions going to the cross, which is why I'm talking about this. Mm-hmm. So not only that, but he displays the greatest example of humility by forgiving his persecutors while being tortured by them.
Yep.
This is why he's the image of God. Because if God were a man, this is what he would do, because God is love. So you could say that Jesus is the image of the invisible God because he's just like him in terms of character. His character did not change here. What changed is his form, his outward appearance. He no longer is appearing as God. He's appearing as a slave. He's not performing the miracles. He's not casting out the demons here. He's just appearing as a slave. His role is what changed, or his conduct. And then finally, we get to the ultimate act of faith, where he yields the Spirit. In Luke chapter 23, verse 46, it says, and shouting with a loud voice, Jesus said, Father, into thy hands am I committing my spirit. Now, saying this, he expires. His final act on this earth, during his life on this earth, is voluntarily surrendering into the hands of his God and Father. This is not the actions of a conquering king, but a slave of God. This display of faithful obedience is the very reason why he was exalted to the current position that he has at the right hand of God Almighty.
Exactly.
Which means if this is the reason why he was exalted there, he didn't literally possess it in an alleged pre-existent life, because then he would have originally been demoted and then exalted to the position that he had. But we'll speak about that in part 3. So he dies not as a powerful king fighting his foes on the battlefield, but as a humiliated slave. It's not like Mike Tyson was fighting his foes. He just gave himself up as a self-sacrifice, which is quite humiliating. This completes the downward movement Paul expresses in Philippians 2, 6-8. He starts in the form of God. He doesn't take advantage of this. Instead, he humbles himself or empties himself and takes the form of a slave and obeys his God and Father all the way to the cross. This is why Paul says he was obedient unto death.
Yep.
He empties his soul unto death, right?
Yes.
Exactly. That's what we will read in a short while.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good that you brought that up, because we're going to be speaking about that soon. Mm-hmm. So when we're talking about the context in Philippians, we spoke about the general context in chapter 1 and chapter 3 and things like this. But if you go into the immediate context, in these verses themselves, the immediate context is the cross. Paul does not say in Philippians 2, 5-8 that Jesus was first in heaven, or that he literally descended from heaven, or that he was born. It makes no mention of his birth. The focus of these verses is not a change of location from heaven to earth. These ideas are absent from the text. Instead, Paul speaks only of mindset, status, behavior, and Christ's obedience unto the death of the cross. Paul is describing an attitude, not a change in cosmic location. If you look at the bottom of this screen, I've kind of listed all the things that we spoke about today, and I've numbered them. The first thing that we see in these verses is Paul describing Jesus being in the outward appearance of God. And then he goes on to say that he didn't exploit his equality with God. Instead, he empties himself, taking on the outward appearance of a slave, becoming obedient. Obedient unto what? Obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. So all these events have to take place around the cross, or at least on the earth during his ministry. So it can't be about an alleged pre-incarnate life thousands of years before the cross. So the emptying is not a change in nature, location, or entering into a womb. It is choosing the path of obedience, despite the great suffering and humiliation that awaited him all the way to the cross. The text interprets itself as entirely earthly, not heavenly. You could say that he had a heavenly mindset, but this is about the location of where these events transpired. It's on the earth. Now that we've spoken about this, we can go into the Old Testament, specifically in Isaiah, where we can go into the prophecy of the suffering servant, which is what Richard just mentioned. And we can compare the two. So since Richard brought this up, you can read some of these slides.
Number 1, both are righteous sufferers who submit to God's will. Isaiah 53:11, Concordant Literal Version. From the toil of his soul he shall see light, and he shall be satisfied by his knowledge. My righteous servant shall justify many, and with their depravities he himself shall be burdened. The servant is righteous, knowing God and obediently bearing the sins of others. Matthew 26:39, and coming forth a little, he falls on his face, praying and saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. However, not as I will, but as thou. Philippians 2:8, becoming obedient unto death. So there's a parallel here. Both figures submit to God's will at the cost of their own lives. Jesus' obedience in Gethsemane clearly aligns with the servant's righteousness and submissive suffering in Isaiah. Self-sacrifice is the key.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes. You can continue to read if you like.
Okay, Isaiah 50. Both take on the role of a slave. Isaiah 52:13. Behold, my servant shall proceed effectively. He shall be exalted and lifted up and very lofty. Isaiah 53:2 and 3. He is growing up like a young shoot before him, and like a root sprout out from arid earth. He has no shapeliness nor honor that we should observe him, and no such appearance that we should covet him. He is despised and shunned of men, a man of pain and knowing illness, and as a man concealing of faces from him, he is despised, and we judge him of no account.
Before you read the next line, Richard, let me just put in Isaiah 52:14 also, which says, just as many were appalled over him, so ruined was his appearance, more than any man, and his shape more than sons of Adam.
Yeah. Philippians 2:7, this corresponds to taking the form of a slave. The servant is despised, unattractive, and rejected. Jesus adopts the appearance, status, and function of a slave, not claiming privilege, but embracing humiliation like the servant. Both have the role of a servant.
Notice the kind of language that's in the Old Testament too, that we should observe him. It's talking about his appearance. So you could say that his outward appearance was that of a slave. Are you noticing the parallels? Of course, this is talking about Christ, but in the times of the Old Testament, they didn't know who the Messiah was. This is just a prophecy of what the Messiah was going to be like as a suffering servant.
Yeah,
so you see the parallels.
And we know how studied Paul was in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. We know that he was a great Pharisee, and it is just like it seems that when Paul was writing the Philippians, he had the Philippian text where he wrote here, and he had this scroll of Isaiah right here. It is so similar.
Yeah.
It is like just explaining it in a new time.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. And it's truly a what is the word?
It is very integrated.
Yeah, but also a step-by-step downward move, so to speak. And Paul summarized it fantastically in Philippians 2.
Yeah, the downward motion.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and this was all done to show the Philippians humility.
Yeah.
So, of course, this would be his prime example, which is the humility of the Messiah, which everyone would have been familiar with at that time. So it makes sense that this would be about Jesus' life during his ministry on the earth. To say that it took place, or at least half of it, took place in the heavens when he allegedly pre-existed as God or as something else is just completely foreign to the text.
Yeah.
And all of this is to show you that, like, what fits with the text more. Paul was most likely very familiar with the scroll of Isaiah. So he's using this. He's drawing from the suffering servant in Philippians.
Yeah.
Okay, so Peter, you can read the next 2 slides.
Okay, another comparison. Both are silent and non-resistant in suffering. Isaiah 53:7 from the CLV. Hard-pressed is he, and he is humbled, yet he isn't opening his mouth. Like a flockling to slaughter is he fetched. And as a ewe before her shearers is mute, he is not opening his mouth. And that's compared to Matthew 26, verse 62 and 63. And rising, the chief priest said to him, "Are you answering nothing? What are these testifying against you?" Yet Jesus was silent. And Matthew 27, verse 12 and through 14. And at his being accused by the chief priests and the elders, he answers nothing. Then Pilate is saying to him, "Are you not hearing how they are testifying against you?" And he did not answer him, not even with one declaration. So both the servant and Jesus are unjustly accused, yet refuse to resist and defend themselves or even retaliate.
Yes.
So this is very clear, yes.
I think this is this the right slide? No, it's not. But you can read this slide too and the next one, because I specifically made the next slide for you, so you can read it.
Oh, because this is the one I was mentioning, but let's continue. Both are numbered with transgressors. So meaning they are categorized in the same way. Isaiah 53 verse 12 from the Concordant Literal Version, and that's the one I mentioned. And with, let me see if this is good. Yes. And with transgressors is he counted. Yet he himself bears the sin of many, and for transgressors shall he make intercession. Luke, and that's compared to Luke 22:37, where it says, "For I am saying to you that this which is written must be accomplished in me, and with the lawless is he reckoned. For that also which concerns me is having its consummation." Mark 15:27, where it says, "And together with him they are crucifying 2 robbers, one at the right and one at the left of him." Both the servants, as you can see, the servant and Jesus are identified with transgressors without being one.
Yes. This verse here is actually really important because Jesus is saying about prophecies that were written concerning me. And I think those prophecies were the prophecies in Isaiah about the suffering servant.
Yeah.
So he's directly parallelizing himself with the suffering servant. So it's not just our opinion. I mean, that's Jesus himself saying that. So
yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think this is the slide. Yes, there you go. So this is the slide.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So, and that's what I thought, because I see Isaiah 53:12 here also, and in the previous one also. So I thought, wait a minute. But anyway, both, in that comparison, both empty themselves. And what does it mean? And we can see that better in Isaiah 53, verse 12, where it says, "Therefore I shall apportion to him among the many, and with the staunch shall he apportion the spoils, inasmuch as he empties out his soul to death, and with transgressors is he counted. Yet he himself bears the sin of many, and for transgressors shall he make intercession." Small remark here. Here you see the emptying in Philippians 2, again confirmed in Isaiah 53, where it says he empties out his soul to death. But we know that we are souls, humans are souls, not celestials. So it can never be about a celestial being who empties out his soul to death. Impossible. So remember that when you study scripture. Next paragraph. Isaiah's servant doesn't merely die, he pours out, exposes, empties out his soul. This is an active, voluntary self-sacrifice. No one can take my life. I give it up freely. And you can compare that, of course, with Philippians 2, verse 6 through 8, where it says, "Who, being inherently in the form of God, deems it not pillaging to be equal with God, nevertheless empties himself," that's the short version, "empties himself, taking the form of a slave, coming to be in the likeness of humanity, and being found in fashion as a human, he humbles himself, becoming obedient unto death, even the death of the cross." Paul's choice of kenosis, empties himself, is best understood through Isaiah 53's servant imagery. A deliberate, obedient giving up of status, honor, and life. Both describe an act of self-sacrifice, not an incarnation from heaven.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, this is probably the most important part in Isaiah when it relates to Philippians, because it tells us when and where and what Jesus empties himself of.
Yeah.
He didn't empty himself of a divine nature, and this didn't take place in heaven. It took place on the earth when he was an adult, just before he was about to be crucified. That's when he empties out his soul unto death. And it's not just some generic kind of death, it's the death of the cross. And the cross occurred on the earth. So this self-emptying could not occur in heaven. It's pretty logical.
So we don't have two stages here. We don't have the stage of him emptying himself of divinity and becoming human, and then emptying himself or humbling himself later to the cross. This is one act.
Exactly.
This is not two acts, and that's what's been brought up to me by several people.
Yep.
The emptying himself is the humility unto death. That's what it is.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And the reason why Paul is bringing this up is because he wants us to imitate the mindset. He's not saying go off and be crucified. That's not what Paul's trying to say here. He's saying have the same mind which Jesus has currently at the right hand of the Father, which is self-sacrificial love, humility.
And he's certainly not saying go ahead and transform yourself into humans.
No.
Exactly.
Which I think that's a slide in part 3 where we'll speak about that. It's impossible for this to be referring to the incarnation because we can't incarnate. You know, I didn't literally pre-exist, so it can't be about that. That's a really good point to bring up.
Unrelatable.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Exactly.
So are we done with this slide? So we can move on? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, we have the 6th one, the last one. I think this is the last one. Both the suffering servant and Jesus experience subsequent exaltation after their humiliation. In Isaiah 52:13, it says, "Behold, my servant shall proceed effectively. He shall be exalted, and lifted up, and very lofty. this is a good example of a Shalia. He's the agent of God.
Yeah.
And you could say that Jesus is the agent of God as he exists right now. God is doing all things through his Son. He's the Lord of Lords and King of Kings because he was exalted to that position. He's at the right hand of God. Therefore, he's not God. Now, if we go back into Philippians, this is, again, we can see the parallels between the suffering servant and Jesus. In Philippians 2, 9-11, it says, wherefore also, or because of this, God highly exalts Jesus and graces him with the name that is above every name, the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, that in the name of Jesus, every knee should be bowing, celestial and terrestrial and subterranean, and every tongue should be acclaiming that Jesus Christ is Lord, because God made him Lord, for the glory of God the Father. And this is, you can look this up in the Old Testament as well, Isaiah 54:23 to back that up. Now, both texts will follow the same pattern here. We see that they have obedience to God first, then they're humiliated because they're obeying their Father's will to be humiliated. They then die, then they're exalted afterwards, specifically after Christ is resurrected, of course. Christ was not demoted. I've already mentioned this, but he was not demoted first, because if that were the case, he would be restored to his original state, not exalted.
Yes.
Okay, well, that's the end now. So
just some observations about the verses we've gone through now. So in the Old Testament, you have the prophecies pertaining to the Messiah. You can divide those usually into two groups. You have the prophecies that are under the category of Mashiach ben Yosef, and you have the ones that go under the category of Mashiach ben David. So there's two types of messianic prophecies. One that is in the type of Joseph, and one that is in the type of David. So what we see here in Philippians is mostly Jesus taking on the form as a slave, which Joseph was. He was a slave. Jews wanted a king. They wanted David to come to kill the Romans and be their king. But this wasn't in the correct order. First, Jesus had to come as a slave, since, of course, Joseph lived before David in time. So there's a timeline here of messianic prophecies that have to occur before Jesus can come and be their king. Jesus never told the Jews that he was their king. They wanted to make him king, but he never said, I am your king.
Yeah.
He was the slave, the type of Joseph, to come and serve, not to rule in this first order of events. He will come and rule and fulfill the Davidic messianic prophecies later.
Exactly.
But in this letter of Philippians, we mostly see the Joseph type of Messiah.
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, he did march into Jerusalem as king, but they rejected him.
Well, he
Yeah,
didn't ride in on a horse because he didn't want to be perceived as a king. He rode in on a mule.
Yeah.
And just like Joseph, Jesus was exalted to God's right hand, just as Joseph were exalted to Pharaoh's right hand.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course.
And on that donkey, Jesus was very sad about Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Of course. I mean, if you could imagine being Christ, the Messiah, of course, your one desire is to save Jerusalem, for them to be born again.
Yeah.
And of course, that's what you want to do right now, because you can do it. You can go out there, you can prove that you're the Messiah when you raise the dead or perform a miracle. But that was not God's plan. And instead of doing his own plan, he obeyed his Father's plan. That's the selflessness. That's the humility, the obedience. And because of that, God exalted him to his right hand. So it means he wasn't at God's right hand literally before he was born. That's a very simple 1 + 1 is 2. It's very simple.
Yeah.
And of course, all of this, what we went through in part 1 and part 2, it all occurred when Jesus was an adult during his ministry on the earth.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very specific.
Okay.
Okay, so do you guys have more to say?
Any questions? Put them in the chat.
Yep. Just put them in the chat and we may respond to them. We may not. It just depends. It
But
just
see,
depends if it's good or not.
Depends on the tone.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
It depends on your humility or your disposition.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it's all about. It's all about mindset. So with that being said, we are going to record part 3 in the future, but they'll all be released at roughly the same time. And with that being said, we hope that you've enjoyed this. We hope that you've learned something from this. Remember to study the scriptures for yourself. Don't just believe everything that we say. With that being said, love, grace, and peace to you all.
God bless.
Love and peace to you. All the best.